All right, good morning again. Let's start chapter 11 with the first agricultural revolution. As you can see from the slide, we are looking at the famous Fertile Crescent. It includes the area of Mesopotamia, which is the land between two rivers. That's the Euphrates here and the Tigris, plus also lands along the Mediterranean and down towards the Persian Gulf. All right, agriculture, of course, develops for a couple of reasons. Right? One is because you have people moving in. So when people started moving out of Eastern Africa and started finding their way, they found themselves places that they could finally settle down. Right? Remember, we talked about hunters and gatherers, and the gatherers would start to understand or recognize that there were certain crops that would appear in the same place every year because they didn't just wander aimlessly. They followed the animals, right? Animals have to know where they're going to get food and water, so they typically return to the same places, and the hunter-gatherers would return there with them. So it was probably when they found areas like Mesopotamia and the Nile River Valley when they first start to understand that this is an area that's going to provide them with the crops they need. So the agricultural revolutions really take place in areas of plenty. Right? These guys don't have time to experiment and see, well, let's see if this works, because if it doesn't work, of course, they're going to be in trouble. They won't be able to feed their clan. So what happens is that you will find people coming back to the same places over time, areas that they know are going to provide them. And this is the place that they'll start to settle because they know that things are coming. And the first agricultural revolution starts to happen in places like this. Over time, and this is a long time, right? These are hundreds of thousands of years. People will start to see that plants can be raised, even wild plants, they can start to raise them for domestic use, right? This is called plant domestication. That's the first aspect of the first agricultural revolution. Probably happens in Southeast and South Asia over 14,000 years ago. So it's a very, very long process. You would start to see things like forests, right? They'd have to have a forest so they could use for wood to burn and also to create houses. They would start to make human settlements. And it was always around an area with fresh water. If you don't have fresh water, people can't live, and certainly you cannot grow your crops. Plant domestication takes place in two forms, right? The first one is root crops. These are crops that come from roots, right? So you're taking part of a plant and replanting it. They are cultivating either the roots that are left over after they've pulled them up, or possibly cuttings from plants. Right? You guys have done this. You've put a plant that's broken off, stuck it in water, and watched the root grow. This is the first area of plant domestication. You're not going to have seed crops until much later, because seed crops take a little more sophistication. You have to kind of understand how to cultivate seeds. What does that mean? That means that you are selecting the seeds that are going to work the best. You're going to have to know how to sow them properly in the fields, water them, tend to them, and make sure that your harvest is well timed. That takes a little more thought process and a little bit more sophistication, so that's going to come second. So root crop first, seed crops will come secondly. Probably seed cropping started in the Fertile Crescent. Right? You have a beautiful area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, area that floods pretty regularly. Right, that flooding brings new material, right? That as it erodes, as it travels down the river, it brings all kinds of minerals that are deposited on the soil. And when the flooding recedes, you've got great new soil that's ready for planting. Same thing in the Nile Valley as well. All right, so this is where you're probably seeing the first ones. All right, the first agricultural revolution starts with the cultivation of seed crops. Right, so you've got plant domestication that's going to start with root crops, but seed crops are probably where you're going to see the first aspects of the first agricultural revolution. Right, several things start to change as you move into this first agricultural revolution, right? People are starting to make distinctions among plants. They are looking to the larger plants to domesticate. And as they continue to use larger plants, right, they are cultivating even larger ones. Larger plants produce a greater yield. A greater yield means that you can have a bigger settlement with more people, right? They start to discover where plants will grow the best. Is it in a wetter area, a drier area, or a combination? The rivers become tools to irrigate. So you'll see people divert water from the rivers and bring them over into the fields. Agriculture is becoming now a reliable food source. So you don't necessarily need to have people out, traveling to gather food, right? They are able to stay in one place, cultivate crops, and gather their food there. They start to learn how to store grains, right? Remember, we've talked about urbanization, that you have to have a surplus in order to have cities grow bigger. And this is where they start to figure out how to store so that they can distribute it later, right? Once you've got this all in place, you start to see a couple of things, right? You start to see permanent settlements. If I know I have a reliable food source that I can grow here, I don't have to keep traveling every 6 months and follow the animals. And as I get better and better, I can start to increase the population. All right, in this next slide, you're going to see where the areas of where the hearths are for agriculture. Some of these take place independently, right? Some of them will have some level of technological distribution to the various areas, but a lot of them will have be independent of each other, and a lot of them will have independent crops, so that a crop that grows in Area 5 in the East African highlands may not grow in the more desert-like areas of north central China. So you're going to see not only some independence, but you're going to see independent crops as well, right? It's the numbers, right? Just kind of give you a little bit of an area of places to go. They're not necessarily in chronological order. And to be honest, it's a lot of discoveries are taking place right now that is giving geographers a little different idea about where some of this took place and the interactions between the two. The table that you see here talks about the various different areas that you saw in the map before, and what it is that they domesticated. Right? There's a bunch of different ones for different places. I'm going to tell you, I have seen a question or two on the AP test about this, these different distributions, and I've never seen one on a free response question. Given that they're probably not going to give you guys a multiple choice on the AP test anymore, I'm not sure that this is something that you need to necessarily worry about all that much. All right, the next area we're going to talk about are domestication of animals. That comes later, and it is a form of agriculture, right? We raise animals for, not just for use in the fields, right, to drag the plows and what have you, but also for protein sources as well. So animal domestication probably began about 10 to 8,000 years ago after plant domestication. All right, the first animals that were probably domesticated were goats and pigs and sheep. You're also going to see that this process doesn't take place until people are more sedentary, right? Until they have the opportunity to build fences and keep animals in the location. People often chose smaller animals, ones that were more docile. You don't want to pick an animal that's going to eat you, so you want to make sure that you work with that's going to be easy to work with and small. Right? You start with small, and then you're going to work your way up. Those animals that were domesticated started to become smaller than the animals that were in the wild. Right? So we kind of had this preference for smaller, more docile animals. Most of the animals who were domesticated were done so about 5,000 years ago. there isn't a lot of animals left out there that can be domesticated. And not surprising, you're going to find that most of the domesticated animals are in the core areas of the world. Core gets everything, as we've kind of learned. There have been current attempts, but they have not been as successful. The picture that you see in front of you is in Nairobi, Kenya, and these are called eland antelopes, kind of cow, horse-like animals. You see the very tall fence in the back because these animals can jump pretty high, and so it's not been all that easy to do. Over the course of history, only about 40 animals have ever been domesticated. Of those animals, the 5 most important are cows, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses. Modern domestication would be fabulous for places like sub-Saharan Africa and other peripheral areas of the world, but unfortunately, they have not been as successful. We've talked a lot about subsistence agriculture, and during this particular time of the first agricultural revolution, that's basically what we're dealing with, right? Growing only enough to survive. Land was very different during the first agricultural revolution. We didn't have necessarily little farms where everybody had their own plot of land and everybody took care of themselves. This is very much a community effort. These were agricultural villages where everybody worked for the benefit of everybody. The land was held in common. Surpluses were shared by the community. As we've moved through the thousands of years since, land has become more individualized. Development has resulted in commercial farming, but the basis of farming at this time is subsistence, and it's community subsistence. It's not just 1 or 2 people working for themselves, but the community working together. Some subsistence farmers, and in this time too, were very sedentary, meaning they just stayed where they were. But eventually that land's going to wear out, right? Without any kind of erosion or replenishing of the minerals, that land will on time wear out. And so some people will move and look for better land. And then it depends on where you are, right? If you're in the middle of the Nile Valley, you don't have to move. If you're in the middle of the Mesopotamia, you don't have to move. But if you're in other areas, you're going to. And what we're going to call this is shifting cultivation, right? Farmers will take a piece of land, cultivate it until it just can't produce anymore, and then they're going to find another area. Most of the shifting cultivation takes place in areas like tropical and subtropical zones, right? When you have an area that depends on shifting cultivation, populations are not going to be as high because you have to worry about whether or not the land's going to support them. One of the types of shifting cultivations that you've read about in your book is called slash and burn agriculture. It's a type of shifting cultivation that involves controlled fire, right? Trees are cut down, all the existing vegetation is then burned off. Sometimes you'll hear it called Swindon or Milpa or patch agriculture. This is a very big favorite of the AP people. They love talking about slashing and burning. Why that's good is because when you burn, all those minerals return to the soil and it rejuvenates it. Problem is that once you've cultivated it and it's drained of all the nutrients, then it's worthless. And then you have to go do it again. So you're having this constant clearing of land, and then land that's no good being left. And then the areas that we've talked about before about desertification, of those deserts growing, of areas that are just worthless anymore. They're just left there, and there's really nothing that they can do, and that land becomes pretty worthless. All right, we're going to stop here, right, and we're going to talk about, in the next chapter, industrialization, and how that affects agriculture and results in the second agricultural revolution. So at this point in time, you're going to finish this one up. You have a set of questions for 11.2, and I want you to answer those and then follow up with your quiz and your study guide for the next section. All right, see you in a little bit.